So this is an interesting little trick or a little thing I had to do. When I finished off this top bracket, I just had bolts going through with a big flat washer on there. But I need those bolts to be recessed in because there's a flat combing that goes all the way around the cockpit, so you don't want anything sticking out here. And the problem then is, how do you drill a counterbore when you've already drilled the hole through? So normally when I would do things like this, I would drill a flat bottomed counterbore with get it in the right place, a sort of spade bit like this, and that gives me a nice flat bottomed hole into which you can put a washer and then a nut or a bolt. The problem is, on this I had to drill and the good thing about doing that is it leaves you a conical shaped hole in the bottom of the flat bottomed hole, which then acts as a guide for a drill bit. So if you're doing this, say for example here, you just start off with that spade bit, drill the big hole, and then drill the smaller hole afterwards. In this case, I had to drill the small hole first because I had to come through from this side. So I didn't know exactly where that counterbore had to be. So the problem then is, how do you drill a counterbore in a hole that's already drilled? And the way you do it is you make up a little guide thing. So this is how I did it anyway. I took a scrap piece of wood and drilled the size hole that I needed through the middle, and then I hit this piece of steel bar that happens to be the right size. What you do is you push this through. If you imagine that counterbore isn't already there, this comes up hard against the timber, and then you use your guide going over this. You clamp this in place very strong, and then when you pull the steel part out, you've got a hole already in the right place to guide your drill bit, and then you know it's going to be the two holes will line up. And that worked really well. So those are now countersunk. When this all gets bolted in place, those bolt heads won't stick out, so they're out of the way. These brackets, once they're bolted on, they're pretty much permanent unless somebody's trying to fix the frame, I guess. So I think I've mentioned before, even though it pains me a little bit to do it, I'll probably use metric bolts for those because they're so much cheaper and I can get them easily. And they're not designed to be taken on and off the car. If anyone ever really strips down the car, then yes, that'll annoy them that the heads of the bolts are wrong. But I think for things that aren't mechanically designed to be bolted on and off the car regularly or for maintenance, then that should be fine. Treating them the same as, say, the wood screws in the wooden frame. There's no reason you'd take those out, for example. So that was my little trick around that. I may have drilled those counterbores a little deeper than I would have liked, really. I could have been a bit shallower, but that's okay. It gets them well out of the way. The next thing I need to do on this, that I want to do tonight, is, if I can find it, I need to look at the seatbelt mounting. I've been rereading up on all the rules around the constructor's manual and historic replicas and how they can bend the rules, or they know the rules need to be flexible for period cars. So a perfect example of that, and one they actually use in their own documentation, is if you're building a modern hot rod, it needs to have burst-proof door latches. Apparently you can buy these. It's a standard hot rod sort of part or modified car part. But they point out those make no sense on something like a timber framed body 1930 Bentley. My Riley isn't a Bentley, obviously, but the construction is much the same. So that's a rule that they can skip. So it gets vague trying to read the rules. I think I mentioned the fuel tank already. According to the manual, you can't solder them, but originally they were soldered. So I'm going to have to ask them, is it okay for me to build a soldered tank? If not, I'll have to make sure I brush up on my aluminium welding, which I need to do anyway. So maybe I'll just make an aluminium tank. It might be easier. But one of the non-bendable rules is seat belts. I have to have at least lap belts. And this is the section in the manual that just talks about seat belts. So this manual is excellent. If you're building a car from scratch, it really does tell you everything you need to know. And if you follow these rules, you can get it through. It goes on about H points. It goes on about doubler plates, things like that. It does talk a lot about older cars where the B-pillars aren't strong enough, or if there isn't a B-pillar. It gets a bit vague because this doesn't really mention lap belts, which I am allowed to use. And it goes on about how the mountings need to go, how the doubler plates need to go. It gets a little bit confusing sometimes figuring out what is applicable to your situation. So for example, this is mild steel. What's this? Mild steel floor, 1.2 millimeters. No swages. How does it have to work? Where do you need stiffeners and things like that? So that's not my situation because I'm bolting it into 3mm chassis rail. So I need to read this and figure out exactly what applies to me to make sure I get it correct. But the reason I've got this is I need to measure things like this, where it explains where the anchors can be, like lower anchors, the positioning from the seat, from the H point. I need to measure it to make sure mine fits within that. Even then, I think there's a section here that says, even with all these rules and all these guidelines, there may be individual cases where it just doesn't work. And in which case you have to, the LVVTA, the organization, can okay certain things, and then the certifier is allowed to certify them based on what they say. That may be the way you get around needing seatbelts in the Austin 7. They didn't have them in period. The manual does say, there should be no reason you can't fit them, but I still think on an Austin 7, without modifying the chassis, it's going to be tricky. But I'm not going to worry about that for now. I'm going to worry about the Riley and get this one sorted and make sure I can actually get the belts in a sensible place, which is going to be in here somewhere. It's that width that worries me, because this isn't a very wide car, and you've got things like the brake cables going down the middle there. Obviously you have to keep the seat belts away from that. I'm not sure there's going to be enough room, so that's what I'm going to look at next. I wasn't happy that I drilled my counter bores a little too deep. I only want the heads to be just under the surface. And then I realized it was easy to fix. I had some hardwood dowel that happens to be the right diameter, 16mm. I just cut off 2 little wedges of that, glued them in and re-drilled the holes. So that works fine, and that'll actually, because the dowel's got the grain going that way, it probably makes it a little bit stronger. But that tidies that up nicely. It's another weekend. Feeling a bit, not unmotivated, but I'm not rushing to do anything just at the moment. Sometimes I have days where I just need to look at things, or I just need to try and figure out how things are going to work. And what I've been looking at now is how the front guards are going to sit, where the headlamps are going to mount, and how I'm actually going to do the mounting points for the guards and the cross stays. You can see I've got something sort of mocked up here with some bits of copper tube. The reason you need those is because you don't want the front guards to vibrate, and the chassis is quite flexible at the front of the car. So these aren't the guards I'm going to use. These are original guards though, but they've been modified. But they give me the right shape, and they've let me set them up to be the right sort of height I want. they're pretty close to the tyres, but that's because you don't have a lot of front suspension travel. You can see down there between the spring and the chassis, there isn't a lot of space. These springs are very stiff. So that actually, how those are sitting at the moment, that gives me plenty of clearance, I think. There are period pictures of cars where they're even closer than that. But the front half of these guards is correct, but the ones I'm going to make will actually come down. They'll be the long flowing guards that go down, and there's a joining point down there. This is where it starts getting interesting, figuring out where the headlamps go so that the back of the bonnet clears them and the stay rods clear them. This is the position I've come up with. The lamps, the front of the lamps are more or less in line with the front crossmember. I will be able to get these sort of stiffening bars, what would you call them, supports. They effectively have sort of a clevis end on each end, and I think what I will do is I will reuse the mounting point for the crossmember. I'll make a little bracket that bolts through here where one of the ends can join on. That's all nice and neat, doesn't mean more holes in the chassis. And at the other end there's just a sort of bracket that goes on the guard on the to a sort of tab there. It does mean they go in front of the headlamps, but I don't think that's a problem. And that's how they were, so that's how it's going to be. For the guards, as I say, the rear mount comes down, it's down about here somewhere, and for the front one you can see I haven't got a lot of space there. On some cars I have seen it where the mount comes out of there. Other cars actually have a different bracket that they use here. Like I say, these are all original cars and they're all different, so it gives me the flexibility to do what I need to do. Other cars have the mount here, which makes a lot more sense to me because there's plenty of space here, there's nothing in the way. This, by the way, is just black irrigation hose, and I heated it up with a hot air gun just to be able to bend it. But that gives me, pretty much shows me how I can do the brackets for the front guards. They will mount down here and come up to the guard up here. So they'll be held here, down the bottom, and then cross-braced across the front. What I do need to decide is, do I make them so that they're easily removable? Not that I'm probably ever going to remove them, but you know, you can make them so that there's a sort of little bracket with a set screw or something. I'm thinking that's what I'll actually do for this, is somehow I'll make it so that this fits in and there's a set screw that holds the guard, just because it's kind of a race car, even though I'm not going to race it. I'm not sure about that yet. I don't know if that'll be stiff enough, rigid enough. You know, maybe it's enough to say, if there's a plate bolted on there and there's just a couple of big bolts holding it, the one down here would be a bit trickier to get to, but you can get to it. Maybe it's just enough to say you would just unbolt those brackets and take the whole thing off. I may just do that. I think that's the way to get them stiff enough. I'm not going to be taking them off, because you have to remember, if you take the guards off, you have to take all this off as well. It would just be a pain in the neck. I can't imagine ever doing that. So I'll probably, the simplest way is just going to be bend up the piece of tube I need and weld it to a flat plate that gets bolted to the chassis rail. That's the easiest way to do that, I think. The other thing I will do is I will use some, I think it's 5mm thick steel plate that I've got, and I'll make the little brackets that go here to hold the lamps, to get the lamp at the right sort of height, so it will come down and have a little bend in it. And I'm hoping this little bend will be enough that I can angle these up and down as I'm going to need to, just to get them pointing in the right direction. They're not going to be adjustable, but I think once they're adjusted the first time, I shouldn't need to adjust them. You can obviously adjust the left and right, but these lamps just bolt straight on. There's no, unlike the later lamps, like the later Lucas ones and things like that. There isn't like a ball joint here, a sort of swivel joint that a lot of them have, which is probably going to be an advantage because often those things shake and they come loose and that sort of thing. So I'm thinking once I've got my 5mm steel here, I should be able to tweak that bend to get the lamps pointing where I need. I'm still looking at the seat belts and how the seat belt mountings work. I do need to paint some of these brackets as well. I should probably do that today actually. And you can see my mock-up of the fuel tank in there. I am going to give it a go with welded aluminium because I've got some, and I've got the gas and I've got the TIG, so there's no harm in me giving it a try. What I will do is I will make up MDF hammer forms to make that sort of end shape, and I will make up a flat panel with a flange on it, and that presses into the end of the tank like that, so you can do a simple sort of a simple weld all the way around the outside. Plus it makes it a bit stiffer, I think. There has to be a couple of baffles inside there. The filler neck comes up something like that. The boot lid fits over it, so to get the boot lid off you take the fuel cap off so you can slide it up over it. It's well within the chassis rails. I will put another angle iron support, which will just be bolted across the chassis at the back there. That'll make one of the mounts, and I can't really do another mount there because of the way the rear these pieces work. It's almost like a forging or a casting type end piece that these go through, so I'll have to make the cradle, and I think I'll have it sit over this, and the straps that hold everything down will wrap around the chassis rail, the rear cross member rather, because that's nice and strong. I can do a nice sort of metal strap, and have the little adjusters here so you can clamp the fuel tank in place, and the fuel tank is attached to the chassis. So hopefully it means you can get the body off without disturbing the fuel tank. And the fuel line, it's one good thing about being an underslung chassis and being an open section is I can just run the fuel line straight up the inside of the chassis leg all the way up to here, up to the firewall, so it'll come up here somewhere. So that's where I'm at with the body. The reason I've kind of got it mocked up like this is I need to take some photos for trying to start getting some of the paperwork through. It doesn't have to be finished, but there's enough here now that you can see what the shape of it's going to be. That's not going to change. Some of the little details may, but that should be enough to show what it is. The other thing I've been doing is I made a little brass bush for the Speedo drive. I decided not to try and do it in two pieces. I just made a single piece one, and I just sort of sanded out you can sort of see it there, that little scallop, and that hole will match up with you can just see it, the oil port in there, and with the felt inside here, that'll keep this all nice and oiled. This is a nice tight fit. I really would have liked a reamer to do this nicely. The inside diameter is 11/64, but I had an 11/64 drill bit, and I found that actually got it close enough, and then I was able to, I don't know what you call it, it's probably not a real technique, but anyone who's done anything like this, I'm sure will have done it themselves. You kind of use the drill bit a bit like a file, and you can just open it out just a fraction, just enough that I needed to make this a nice fit on here without any wobble. So that will go back in there. I'll hold it in place with Loctite. I'm going to set it up on the mill. This is how I actually held this. It was really hard to find what's flat on this because it is a die cast piece. So in the end, I just went with, okay, it looks like it's flat enough like that. If I clamp it like this, the front face is, the these legs are flat because that's where the face of the instrument goes. So I figured that was going to be close enough. And there's a little bit of, I just clamp it lightly because this would break really easily. There's just a tiny amount of play between the brass sleeve and the body here, which I milled out 6mm because that's what the cutter I've got. So what I'm going to do next is I will use that 11/16 drill bit in the mill to make sure this is now perpendicular to this. So I'll set it all up, put the Loctite on it, and that'll ensure that everything is kept straight. That's what I'm hoping anyway. So we'll see how that goes. I need to clean everything up before I use the Loctite. Yeah, I think that's all at the moment. This just shows how I set this up in the mill to be able to get that little brass sleeve in there and make sure it was all straight. This is actually my second attempt because the first attempt all I managed to do was Loctite the sleeve to the drill bit. So I couldn't get the drill bit out. So I had to use heat to get the Loctite to release and then gave it another go. I'm using 638, the bearing retainer stuff, which should work really well. And while that's been setting, I've been playing with my lathe. I've actually ordered a little magnetic DRO to go on this. I think that'll be really useful. And I've also just been cleaning it up a bit. So I completely stripped the chuck and cleaned that up. I've always had a slight problem with it where the jaws didn't seem to grip very well. And I took it apart and cleaned it up and finally figured out what the problem was. So the problem was only really when I had long pieces of steel or material inside the chuck. If I had something short, just on the, only held by the jaws sort of around this point, it was fine. It was only if it went into the body of the chuck that things started being wobbly. And what I noticed was when I did up the chuck jaws, you could actually see, if you were using a piece of straight material, this is stainless steel rod, you could actually see a gap between the jaws and the material. And these jaws are obviously in the chuck at the moment, so it's a bit hard to see. You can see the little holes. This is the outside jaws, and you can see how this basically has to be ground parallel to the axis of the lathe, because the jaws need to clamp up on it, and they need to clamp up on it flat, if that makes sense. And it seems what had happened on mine was the jaws had worn somehow, or something was wrong with them, and the ground part at the back, so the bit that's further inside here, it wasn't parallel. Basically, this wasn't ground parallel, or it had been reground at some point, or something. It was just wrong. And in the end, I figured out if I shut the chuck jaws and slid a piece of bar like this in from this end, you could tighten the jaws down so it would be a nice sliding fit in the jaws going in this direction, and then it would get stuck. It would stop at the back. And it might have just been a little burr or something. I couldn't really see anything. So what I ended up doing to try and fix that, and this is probably not the right way to do this. I don't know how these things would have been made originally, how you're supposed to fix it, but I thought I'll give this a try. I used another piece of my stainless steel rod, and I put it into the chuck here, and I used, where's it gone? Here it is. Grinding paste. And I just smeared it with grinding paste and slowly fed it in and out of the jaws with the lathe on. And I did that bit by bit by bit and slowly tightened it up. You have to stop it, obviously, to tighten it up. Stop it, tighten it up a fraction, feed it in, and I got to the point where I could actually feel that it was rubbing on the back but not the front. So I just kept grinding it. It didn't take very long at all. I'm sure it must have, maybe it was just a burr, or it was a little bit deformed or something. But I got it to the point where it would it would slide in and out nicely all the way. And it seems to have fixed it now, so there's no gap there. I don't know the proper way to measure run out on something like this, and also I don't know how accurate this stainless steel rod is. It's not like ground rod or anything, so it's probably not the most accurate thing either. But this is an inch out from the chuck, and I seem to have about 2 thou of run out there. I don't know if that's good or bad. I think that's probably pretty bad, but it's a heck of a lot better than it was, where if I had a piece in it like this in there before, you would noticeably see this wobbling when you ran the lathe. So I don't know if I can get that any better, or what that should be, or how you even measure this. So obviously an inch out, any error is going to be magnified because it's sticking out further. I guess maybe you measure it right up close in here. And as I say, this is just stainless steel rod. It's not precision ground or anything like that. So I don't know if this is the best way to do this, but at least now there's no, you can't see daylight between the jaws and whatever it is you're trying to clamp in there. So that was definitely wrong, and it seems better now. I'll see how it goes. I always used to wonder why, whenever I was machining longer things, they always seemed to be off-center or a bit wobbly, and that was why it just couldn't grip them properly. So that was another little job. When it comes to the DRO, the one I bought it uses a magnetic tape rather than optical scales. So the one I've got on the mill uses optical. This one uses a magnetic tape. It's quite thin, and I believe it's got sort of a metal cover over it. And the reader head is only about 1 inch long, 1/2 inch square. What I'm going to do is, mounting it on the back of the lathe is no problem. It's all flat back here. I just need a bracket that comes off the carriage with the reader head sort of here somewhere. And on here, what I think I'll need to do is I'll have to drill and tap a little plate or a little arm that comes on here, and it's going to have to stick out basically the travel of this, because I need to mount the reader for that here. The reason it needs to go there is obviously there's no way you can put it on the front here. It'll get in the way of the chuck, and you don't want to mount it here because then it limits your limits the tailstock movement. And on a little lathe like this, you want to be able to get the tailstock as close as you can. So I don't want to put anything in there because that'll reduce the distance here. The reason that's important is on a little lathe like this, I've only got about 1.5 inches of travel on the tailstock. You can see the scale finishes 1.5 inches. So you don't want to reduce that any more than you have to. So yeah, I think there'll be a little bracket that comes off here somehow, off the back probably, and the reader head will be here, and this will extend so that this is all the way forward. That extension will have to be about that long so that the end of the tape is here, and then it can travel out that way. But I've got plenty of space behind there, so I think that's how that'll work. And what I will do is, there's a couple of screws holding the back panel on here. I can probably reuse those, and I'll make a little aluminium plate that sits up here with the display. So yeah, other little jobs that distract me. I have been oiling everything down as well, because now it's winter, condensation is a problem again. I do have my dehumidifier, that's definitely helping. And I don't know if my vent, in summer I put in a little spiral vent up there just to get a bit more airflow. Maybe that's helping as well. But the dehumidifier works. I did have to buy a desiccant style dehumidifier rather than a refrigeration type, because they won't work down to really low temperatures. So I want something that'll work when the temperature in here gets down to close to zero. I don't think it ever gets beyond zero. It doesn't get that cold here. But That seems to be working pretty well. It's sucking heaps of moisture out of the air anyway. But I still keep oiling everything down. You can see this is all shiny again because I stripped it completely and cleaned it up. So, yeah, as I say, little jobs that distract you. Again, I'm sure any real machinist would be horrified at how I fixed this, but it has really made it a lot better. So before, I was never able to get something like this anywhere close, just being clamped in the chuck jaws like that. It would be way off. So it's definitely made it closer. Again, this isn't any sort of precision steel or anything like that. It's just a piece of metal tube. But yeah, it's definitely way better now, and there is no gap. Along here, if you shine a bright light behind it, you can see quite a tiny gap by doing that. So yeah, that sort of lapping it in definitely helped. I'm not going to try and get it any better than that. I'll probably end up messing it up. But what I actually wanted to show was that the little bush for this has worked really well. It spins freely and there is no play at all. So that's it rocking on the lathe. So there's no play in that whatsoever. The oil hole lines up. When I first put the little drive through, it was a little bit stiff, and I put a drop of oil down in there, and it suddenly became really smooth again. So I think that works. All I have to do now is totally disassemble the Speedo again, and all the drums and the springs and the little bits and pieces, and reassemble it back onto this base, and then I should have a nice working Speedo with a trip meter, which would be good.